Imagine drowning, but not in water. Imagine a tidal wave of hot, black sludge hitting you at 35 miles per hour. You open your mouth to scream, but the liquid instantly glues your jaws shut and fills your lungs with a sweet, suffocating cement. In a single heartbeat, men and horses were snapped like twigs and trapped like prehistoric insects in amber. This was not a nightmare. It was a massacre executed by a confection. This is the day a harmless baking ingredient became a weapon of mass destruction, turning a city street into a sticky, suffocating grave. In the heart of Boston's North End, on the 15th of January in the year 1919, the air held a deceptive, unseasonable warmth that felt less like a gift of winter and more like a fever dream. The temperature had climbed near 40 degrees, a sudden and unnatural spike that caused the frozen ground to sweat and the city to exhale a fog of confusion. Standing near the harbor on Commercial Street was a titan of riveted steel, a tank 50 feet tall and 90 feet wide, looming over the wooden tenements, firehouses, and cobblestone streets like a silent, gluttonous idol. Inside its belly sloshed more than 2,300,000 gallons of fermented molasses, a dark, viscous ocean waiting to be turned into industrial alcohol and munitions for a war that had technically ended, but whose machinery still hungered for fuel. The tank did not sit quietly. It groaned and popped under the thermal expansion, a metallic beast suffering from indigestion, its steel skin stretching to the breaking point as the fermentation process within accelerated in the heat, producing carbon dioxide that pushed against the walls with the pressure of a bomb. Residents had long grown used to the ominous rumbles, dismissing them as the mundane complaints of industry, unaware that the structure was not merely holding liquid but restraining a kinetic force equal to a tidal wave. The tank had been weeping tears of sticky brown syrup down its gray flanks for months, a structural failure so obvious and so ignored that the neighborhood children would run up with sticks to collect the sweet leakage. Instead of repairing the groaning metal or reinforcing the stressed seams, the owners had painted the entire tank a muddy brown, a cosmetic deception designed to camouflage the leaks and hide the danger in plain sight. This was a monument to negligence painted in the color of its own contents, a silent conspiracy between greed and physics that was about to reach its catastrophic conclusion. The ground beneath the tank vibrated with a low-frequency hum, a secret warning that the rivets, stressed beyond their engineering limits, were screaming for release. Those who walked past the tank that morning reported hearing strange sounds, like the cracking of knuckles on a giant hand or the sharp retort of distant gunfire, which were actually the sounds of bolts shearing off one by one, surrendering to the impossible strain. The air around the tank smelled faintly of fermentation and rust, a cloying scent that stuck to the back of the throat. It was the smell of a beast waking up. At 12:30, the lunchtime lull had settled over the waterfront, and the streets were filled with workers, delivery wagons, and pedestrians enjoying the strange warmth, completely oblivious to the shadow stretching over them. They stood in the path of a monster that was not made of flesh and bone, but of iron and sugar, a monster that was currently holding its breath, waiting for the single, final rivet to snap and unleash a hell that no one in the city could possibly imagine. For months, the tank had wept tears of sticky brown syrup down its gray flanks, a structural failure so obvious and so persistent that it had become a macabre fixture of the neighborhood, a sweet and deadly secret shared by the entire North End. The leakage was not merely a drip but a constant, oozing perspiration of industrial negligence, pooling in the crevices of the cobblestones and staining the earth with a dark, sugary sludge that drew flies, rats, and the innocent curiosity of children. These children, oblivious to the monstrous pressure building behind the steel plates, would run up to the base of the Titan with sticks and pails, scraping the molasses from the rivets to lick it clean, tasting the raw, fermented sweetness of a disaster waiting to happen. To them, the tank was a magical, infinite confection. To the men who worked in its shadow, it was a groaning, unstable beast that smelled of alcohol and imminent ruin. Instead of repairing the groaning metal or reinforcing the seams that were clearly crying out for relief, the owners had chosen a solution that was as cynical as it was cosmetic, They had painted the entire tank a muddy brown, a hue specifically chosen to match the color of the leaking molasses. It was a deception designed to camouflage the leaks and hide the danger in plain sight, a coat of paint applied over a fracture in reality, transforming the visual evidence of impending collapse into a uniform, nondescript facade. This was a monument to negligence painted in the color of its own contents, a silent conspiracy between greed and physics that relied on the hope that if the cracks could not be seen, they simply did not exist. But the tank knew better, and so did the laws of thermodynamics. On this particular afternoon, the temperature climbed over 40 degrees, a sudden, feverish thaw in the heart of winter that confused the very chemistry of the cargo inside. The fermentation within the tank, usually slowed by the January chill, awakened with a violent intensity, the yeast and sugar reacting in a frenzy of biological activity that churned the 2,300,000 gallons of liquid into a roiling, living mass. The byproduct of this resurrection was carbon dioxide, gas that expanded rapidly, pushing against the steel walls with the pressure of a bomb, seeking any weakness, any microscopic flaw in the metal that had been stressed and re-stressed for years. The tank was no longer just a storage vessel. It was a pressurized lung holding its breath, its ribs of steel groaning under a tension that defied engineering logic. The rivets, which had held fast through the freezing nights and the vibration of the elevated trains, finally surrendered to the impossible strain, their metal fatigue reaching a terminal point that no coat of brown paint could suppress. It began not with a splash, but with a sound that ripped through the lunchtime lull like a declaration of war, a sharp, staccato report that froze every soul on Commercial Street. It sounded like machine gun fire, a rapid, rhythmic cracking as thousands of steel bolts sheared off in rapid succession, decapitated by the sheer outward force of the molasses. The sound was violent and mechanical, the scream of metal being murdered by physics, and bullets of iron shot across the street, embedding themselves in wood and brick like shrapnel from an artillery shell. Then came the tear, a sound so loud and profound it felt less like a noise and more like a physical blow to the chest, a deep, guttural rending of the earth's fabric that sounded like the sky itself was ripping open. The steel walls of the tank, liberated from their rivets, did not merely fall. They peeled back with terrifying speed, opening like the petals of a carnivorous flower or the pages of a book slammed open by a giantess hand. The ground jumped, a seismic convulsion that knocked horses to their knees and rattled the windows of the firehouse until they shattered in their frames. For a fraction of a second, there was a vacuum, a suspension of time where the massive wall of dark liquid hung in the air, a towering cliff of brown death defying gravity before the laws of nature reasserted themselves. Then, the collapse. The bottom of the tank disintegrated, and the wave was released, not a flow, not a spill, but a kinetic explosion of density and weight. The sheer energy of the release created a wind that swept people off their feet before the liquid even touched them, a shockwave of displaced air that carried with it the heavy, suffocating scent of raw sugar and alcohol. The noise of the rupture was swallowed by the roar of the wave, a grinding, churning thunder that sounded like a freight train derailment amplified 1,000 times. In that instant, the deception of the brown paint, the innocence of the children with their sticks, and the arrogance of the industrial owners were all obliterated by a force that had no conscience, no mercy, and no patience left. The tank had finished weeping. Now, it was screaming, and the city of Boston was about to taste the full, unbridled weight of its neglect. The explosion was deafening, a thunderclap that shattered windows half a mile away, but the silence that followed was instantly filled by a roar more terrifying than fire, a low-frequency rumble that vibrated in the chest cavities of everyone within a 5-block radius. The steel plates of the tank, half an inch thick and weighing tons, did not merely fall. They were hurled outward with the violence of shrapnel, slicing through the air and severing the support beams of the elevated railway as if they were dry twigs. The tank peeled back like the skin of a banana, exposing the dark, pulsating core of the disaster, and a wall of molasses, 25 feet high and moving at 35 miles per hour, erupted into the streets. It was not a slow-moving sludge or a comical spill. It was a battering ram of liquid density, a tsunami of black syrup that was 40% heavier and infinitely more viscous than water, possessing a kinetic energy that turned it into a landslide of living darkness. The wave did not splash. It crushed, pulverizing everything in its path with the relentless, unthinking force of a glacier moving at the speed of a racehorse. The air was instantly sucked out of the streets, replaced by a wind generated by the wave's displacement, a gust so powerful it hurled men and carts through the air like discarded toys before the liquid even touched them. High above the street, the Atlantic Avenue elevated train track, a structure of iron and rivets designed to withstand the weight of locomotives, groaned in protest as the wave of molasses slammed into its supports. The metal screamed, a high-pitched shriek of tortured iron that cut through the roar of the flood, and the tracks twisted like a licorice stick, buckling and snapping under the impossible pressure. A train car, filled with passengers who had been staring out at the harbor just moments before, was left dangling precariously over the abyss of churning syrup, the steel girders beneath it bent into grotesque shapes by the sweet, dark hand of the wave. Below, the firehouse of Engine 31, a sturdy brick building that had stood as a sentinel of safety, was struck with such force that it was knocked entirely off its foundation. The brick walls did not simply crumble. They exploded inward, the mortar and stone turning into missiles that decimated the interior, burying the firefighters and their equipment in a tomb of masonry and molasses. The building collapsed with a sound that was felt rather than heard, a deep, sickening thud that signaled the erasure of shelter, the destruction of safety, and the absolute dominance of the fluid over the solid. There was no time to run, no time to scream, and certainly no time to understand the absurdity of the doom that was descending upon the north end. The wave moved faster than thought, faster than reflex, catching horses, wagons, and men in a suffocating, sweet embrace that offered no mercy and no escape. Dray horses, tethered to their delivery wagons, rolled their eyes in panic as the black wall loomed over them, their hooves scrabbling uselessly against the cobblestones before they were swallowed whole, their terrified whinnies cut short by the thick, clogging syrup. The wagons themselves were lifted and tossed like driftwood in a hurricane, smashed against buildings or pulverized into splinters that mixed with the churning liquid. Pedestrians who had turned to look at the sound of the explosion saw the sky turn brown before the darkness overtook them, the molasses hitting them not with the force of water, but with the impact of a solid object, breaking bones and crushing lungs instantly. The substance was so thick that swimming was impossible. To be caught in it was to be encased in a moving solid, a suffocating blanket that filled the nose and mouth with a cloying, sticky death. The waves surged through the narrow streets, filling basements and crushing the first floors of tenements, trapping families in their homes and turning familiar rooms into drowning chambers. The streets of Boston were transformed in seconds into a surreal, alien landscape of dark, churning destruction, where the laws of physics seemed to have been rewritten by a mad confectioner. The molasses, heated by fermentation and the friction of its own movement, steamed in the cool air, creating a fog of sweet, sickly vapor that blinded survivors and coated the lungs of those gasping for breath. It flowed around corners with a sentient, predatory hunger, hunting for outlets, smashing through doors and windows, and filling every void with its relentless mass. Debris bobbed on the surface of the wave, shards of timber, twisted metal, the wheels of wagons, and the heartbreaking shapes of human bodies, all carried along by the brown tide that scoured the earth clean of life. The roar of the wave began to subside only when the tank had fully emptied its belly, but the silence that followed was heavy, wet, and punctuated by the creaking of settling ruins and the muffled, gurgling sounds of a city drowning in its own industry. The familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by an undulating sea of brown sludge that rippled and settled, hiding the devastation it had wrought beneath a glossy, opaque surface. In the span of a few heartbeats, the bustling waterfront had become a sticky, chaotic graveyard, a place where the sweetness of the cargo had become the bitterest of poisons, and the industry that fed the city had risen up to devour it whole. To drown in water is a mercy compared to the fate of those caught in the flood of 1919, for water is a clean killer, a fluid that yields to the desperate thrashing of the dying. But the molasses was a sentient, suffocating blanket that denied its victims even the dignity of a struggle. When the wave struck, it did not wash over people. It engulfed them, filling the nose, mouth, and throat instantly with a thick, warm sludge that tasted of iron and fermentation, sealing the airways with a glue that no amount of coughing could clear. The instinct to gasp for air became a fatal error, as every inhalation drew the viscous liquid deeper into the lungs, coating the delicate alveoli in a layer of impenetrable syrup that blocked oxygen transfer completely, turning the body's own respiratory system into a clogged, useless machine. This was not merely drowning. It was a slow, agonizing asphyxiation by confectionery, a death where the last sensation was the cloying, overwhelming sweetness of a substance meant for cakes and rum, now transformed into an instrument of absolute terror. The temperature of the molasses, raised by the fermentation process inside the tank, added a layer of thermal shock to the physical trauma, scalding the skin and throat of those it enveloped, creating a sensory overload of heat, pressure, and taste that shattered the mind before the lack of air could claim the brain. Those who fought against the current found themselves trapped in a non-Newtonian nightmare, where the physics of the fluid turned their own survival instincts against them. Molasses is a sheer thickening fluid, meaning that the more force is applied to it, the more viscous and solid-like it becomes. So when victims thrashed and kicked to swim to the surface, the liquid hardened around their limbs like quick-setting cement, locking them in place. The harder they struggled, the tighter the fluid gripped them, transforming the street into a vast, sticky trap that punished movement with immobility, holding men and women suspended in a dark amber stasis while they suffocated mere inches from the air. Men were tumbled like pebbles in a stream, their limbs snapped not by impact with the ground, but by the sheer, crushing weight of the sugary avalanche itself, which pressed against the chest with such force that ribs cracked and hearts struggled to beat against the external pressure. The wave carried with it a debris field of shattered timber, twisted iron, and pulverized brick, turning the flood into a grinding slurry that flayed skin and crushed bone, pinning bodies against walls that crumbled under the impact, burying the living and the dead together in a chaotic, brown tomb. The sensory horror was absolute, a cacophony of destruction that assaulted every faculty of the human experience. Visually, the world had been erased, painted over in a single, monotonous shade of sludge brown that hid the depth of the danger and the location of the victims, making rescue a game of blind, desperate guessing. Auditory terror filled the air, defined not by the roar of the wave, which had passed, but by the terrifying, wet silence of those buried beneath the surface, punctuated by the gurgling, muffled cries of those whose heads remained free but whose bodies were crushed in the grip of the syrup. Above this low frequency of human suffering rose the high, panicked whinnies of dying horses, animals whose immense strength was useless against the fluid, their eyes rolling in terror as they sank, their nostrils flaring to pull in air, but receiving only the thick, sweet death that surrounded them. The smell was perhaps the most insidious element of all, a thick, pervasive miasma that hung over the north end like a shroud. The heavy, sickly sweet aroma of raw molasses, fermented and warm, mixing with the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood and the sour reek of terror, sweat, and bowels released in death. It was a massacre executed by a confection, a scene where the harmless ingredient of childhood treats became a weapon of suffocating torture, creating a cognitive dissonance that broke the minds of those who witnessed it. Rescuers who waded into the mess found themselves fighting the same physics that killed the victims, their boots sticking to the ground with every step, the molasses sucking at their legs as if the earth itself was hungry. To pull a body from the muck was a Herculean task, often requiring 3 or 4 men to extract a single victim, and frequently, the force required to break the suction was enough to dislocate joints or tear clothing from the flesh. The molasses did not just kill, It humiliated, stripping its victims of their humanity, coating them in a degrading, sticky glaze that made them look like grotesque statues rather than people. In the basements of the tenements, where the wave had poured in through shattered windows, entire families were trapped in the dark, the liquid rising steadily to the ceiling, the air pocket shrinking with every minute, leaving them to wait in the pitch blackness as the sweet, warm tide rose to claim them. The horror was intimate and slow, a claustrophobic ending in the dark, surrounded by the smell of sugar and the sound of the structure groaning under the weight of the flood. Every breath was a battle, every movement a mistake, and as the minutes stretched into hours, the realization settled upon the survivors that they were not merely caught in a disaster, but were being digested by the city itself, consumed by the very industry that had promised them a livelihood. The flood of 1919 was not just an event of physical destruction. It was a psychological trauma etched in sugar, a nightmare where the familiar comfort of sweetness was revealed to be a heavy, suffocating mask for death. As the initial wave settled, the horror shifted from kinetic violence to a slow, freezing tomb, marking a transition from the chaos of the crash to the silent, creeping dread of the aftermath. The unseasonable warmth of the day, which had acted as the catalyst for the disaster, began to fade as the sun dipped below the horizon, giving way to the biting chill of a typical New England winter evening. With every degree the temperature dropped, the physics of the disaster altered once more. The molasses, which had flowed like deadly lava in the heat of the afternoon, began to congeal, its viscosity increasing exponentially as the cold seeped into the dark mass. What had been a churning river was rapidly transforming into a vast, sticky trap, a hardening plain of sugar that threatened to preserve the devastation exactly as it lay. The streets of the North End were no longer flooded. They were paved in a substance that gripped like tar and hardened like resin, encasing the wreckage and the victims in a suffocating embrace that defied the efforts of the living to reclaim the dead. The silence that fell over the disaster zone was heavy and unnatural, broken only by the squelching struggle of those trying to move through the muck and the rhythmic hissing of steam from the destroyed boiler rooms of crushed buildings. Rescuers from the Red Cross, the Navy, and the local police force waded into the waist-deep muck, but every step was a battle against a substance that refused to yield. The molasses acted with a malevolent kind of physics. It allowed a boot to sink in easily, but resisted the upward pull with a suction so powerful it felt as though the earth itself was clutching at their ankles. Men exhausted themselves merely by walking 10 yards, their chests heaving, their clothes heavy and stiff with the cooling syrup, looking less like saviors and more like monsters emerging from a swamp. The rescue effort became a grotesque form of excavation, where pulling a survivor free often meant stripping the clothes from their bodies or tearing their skin, as the fabric and flesh had bonded with the hardening sugar. There were moments of agonizing decision where a trapped limb had to be abandoned to the grip of the molasses to save the life attached to it, or where the sheer exhaustion of the rescuers forced them to pause while cries for help faded into the stiffening air. Lanterns cast long, distorted shadows across the gloss-black surface, illuminating a landscape that looked less like a city street and more like the surface of an alien planet, uneven, shiny, and concealing horrors beneath its cooling crust. They found bodies preserved in grotesque poses, suspended in the thick fluid like prehistoric insects trapped in amber, their final moments of terror immortalized in a medium usually reserved for sweetness. The molasses had coated them entirely, filling eyes, ears, and mouths, smoothing over the features until the victims were reduced to anonymous, brown sculptures of agony. Identification became a nightmare. The glaze masked the faces of fathers, mothers, and children, rendering them unrecognizable even to their kin, forcing families to identify their loved ones by the shape of a hand, a ring on a finger, or the specific tear in a shirt that was barely visible beneath the sludge. The dead were not merely killed, they were erased, their humanity stripped away by the homogenizing layer of industrial waste. Some were found standing upright, pinned against walls, looking for all the world as if they were simply pausing for breath, while others were curled in fetal positions, encased in a hardened shell that had to be chipped away before they could be moved. The recovery of the dead was not a matter of lifting. It was a matter of mining, of digging through a substance that grew harder with every passing hour of the night. The cleanup would take weeks, a Herculean labor that required the brute force of hydraulic power and the precision of stonemasonry. Ordinary water was useless against the hardened syrup. It merely skated over the surface or turned the top layer into a slick, treacherous slime. Instead, fireboats were called in to pump endless gallons of salt water from the harbor, blasting the streets with high-pressure jets to cut through the grime. The salt in the water chemically attacked the sugar, breaking down its molecular bonds, dissolving the brown ice that had choked the neighborhood. Yet, even with the hoses, the work was slow. In the shadows and basements where the water could not reach, men used chisels, saws, and shovels to hack away the hardened syrup, breaking it into chunks like coal to be carted away. The sound of metal striking hardened molasses rang out through the north end for days, a mournful tapping that signaled the slow reclamation of the city from the grip of the disaster. The environmental impact was immediate and overwhelming. The harbor, usually a churning gray-green, ran brown until summer, the water stained by the millions of gallons of runoff that poured from the streets. Fish died by the thousands, suffocated by the deoxygenated water, their bodies washing up on the piers coated in the same sticky film that had claimed the humans on shore. The very stones of the north end absorbed the sugar, drinking it deep into their pores, staining the granite and brick with a permanent, dark discoloration that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. The smell of molasses did not fade with the washing. It soaked into the wood of the houses, the earth of the cellars, and the fabric of the city's history. It became a sensory phantom, rising from the pavement on hot days for decades to come, a cloying, sickly sweet reminder of the day the earth opened up and the industry that fed the city tried to swallow it whole. The neighborhood had been drowned not by the wrath of the sea, which they had always feared, but by the hubris of industry, a man-made deluge that left behind a stain that was visible on the streets and invisible in the lungs of a traumatized generation. Decades later, long after the lawsuits were settled and the twisted wreckage of the tank was dismantled and sold for scrap, the people of the North End claimed that the disaster had never truly left them, but had simply changed its form from a physical wave to a sensory phantom. The legal battles that followed the flood were as viscous and slow-moving as the molasses itself, dragging on for 6 years in a courtroom saga that generated 25,000 pages of transcript, a paper monument to the 21 lives extinguished by corporate negligence. The owners, the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, had tried to claim that the tank was destroyed by anarchists, a convenient narrative of sabotage meant to absolve them of the sin of ignoring the structural groans of their own creation. But the truth was far more mundane and far more terrifying. The tank had simply been too weak to hold its own greed. When the verdict finally came, finding the company liable, it was a victory of sorts, but no amount of settlement money could scrub the memory from the minds of those who had seen the sky turn brown. The tank was gone, the site paved over, eventually becoming a park where children played baseball on ground that had once been a killing field, yet the earth itself seemed to possess a memory that concrete could not stifle. The tragedy left a stain that went deeper than the cobblestones. It was a permanent scar on the history of the city, a lesson written in sugar and blood that festered in the collective subconscious of Boston. On cool days, the city smelled of salt water and exhaust, of roasting coffee and the brisk Atlantic wind, and it was easy to pretend that the year 1919 was just a date in a history book. But on the hot, humid days of July and August, when the sun beat down on the brick tenements and the air grew thick and still, the atmosphere would shift. The heat seemed to bake the streets, drawing out a dormant presence from the pores of the earth, and the air would begin to weep the sickly sweet scent of molasses. It was not the pleasant aroma of a bakery or the comforting smell of rum. It was a heavy, cloying stench that coated the back of the throat, a fermentation of the past rising to choke the present. It was a ghostly olfactory memory, a reminder that the city had never truly been scrubbed clean, that the 2 million gallons of fluid had soaked so deeply into the wood, the mortar, and the soil that the very infrastructure of the North End had been marinated in the disaster. For the survivors, who grew old watching the neighborhood rebuild, this scent was a trigger for a terror that defied language. A simple shift in the wind could transport an elderly man back to his childhood, paralyzed in the street as a wall of darkness descended upon him, or remind a grandmother of the brother she lost to the suffocating grip of the syrup. They would pause in the middle of their daily routines, eyes widening as the invisible ghost passed through the streets, the sweetness acting as a summoning spell for the screams of the dying and the roar of the collapsing steel. Visitors to the city, walking the Freedom Trail or searching for an Italian dinner, might smell the faint trace of syrup and smile, thinking of candy or confections, remarking on the pleasant, sugary note in the air. They saw the North End as a place of charm and history, oblivious to the fact that they were inhaling the exhaust of a massacre. But the locals knew the truth, and they exchanged knowing, grim glances when the smell returned. They knew that the scent was not the aroma of life or joy. It was the perfume of the dead, the lingering breath of 21 souls and countless animals who had breathed their last in a darkness that tasted of sweet, suffocating greed. The persistence of the smell served as a macabre testament to the permanence of the event, a signal that while the physical wreckage had been cleared, the metaphysical weight of the disaster remained. It suggested that the molasses had not merely washed away but had become part of the city's DNA, a sugar-coated curse that refused to evaporate. Even as the 20th century marched on, bringing with it new wars, new technologies, and new skylines, the ghost of the tank remained the neighborhood's oldest resident, waiting for the heat to give it a voice. It was a haunting that required no chains or specters, only the sun and the wind. The horror lay in the corruption of the innocent. Sugar, the very symbol of reward and childhood delight, had been weaponized by negligence, forever tainting the concept of sweetness for a generation. To taste syrup was to taste fear. To smell molasses was to smell the grave. And so, on those stifling summer afternoons, when the air hung heavy and brown scented over the harbor, the city of Boston was forced to remember that it was built not just on granite and liberty, but on a foundation of fragile steel and the hubris of men who thought they could contain a tidal wave in a tin can. The sweetness was not a fragrance. It was a haunting, an eternal, sticky reminder that some stains are too deep to ever wash away, and that the past, like the molasses itself, is slow to move, hard to escape, and impossible to forget.